Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Prosperous Nonprofit Podcast. And I'm really excited to be here today with Dr. Mark Scott from the Oishei Foundation. Mark, welcome.
Good to be with you. Thank you for having me this morning.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to talk to you today. We have done some collaboration over the last couple months, which we may chat about as well. And I think that the work that you're doing with Oishei is really sort of innovative in the nonprofit sector. So we're definitely going to get into that. But first, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and what you do now?
Well, hopefully I won't put your listeners to sleep here talking about me, but yeah. I'm a native of Niagara Falls, New York, and I say that proudly because we've certainly seen better days in Niagara Falls. But I'm a glass half full person, so I believe better days are ahead. A native of Niagara Falls, I've done a lot of kind of cool things in my career. First job out of college was at Walt Disney World. I worked at Epcot Center as a manager there in their parks.
Cool.
Spent several, yeah. It's pretty little interesting tidbit in my background. But then spent many years after that working in contracted services in the healthcare space. Fast forward to early or late 90s, spent some time at Canisius College working in their opportunity programs office. And it was amazing work, but we were always under threat of extinction because we were aligned in the state's budget. So I'm sure your listeners will appreciate that. I know you do, Stephanie. And then again, return back to the contractor services space and just found myself always in a car, always on a plane, always on a train, covering multiple states. Amazing work, amazing teams, amazing healthcare organizations, but I really wanted to quiet life down a little bit. And so I searched for what I thought was the perfect place for me, and I found SUNY Geneseo, the State University of New York at Geneseo. And so they had a posting for an executive director for campus auxiliary services. And the way I describe auxiliary services, at least in New York State, is all the things that students and parents don't want to pay for. Service-wise, are organized under separate 501c3 corporations at each state university campus. And so I ran that corporation and its affiliated entities for a little over 11 years. Pretty big corporation, nearly 400 employees. A collective bargaining agreement in place. So there was a union as part of our group, salaried labor, student labor, et cetera. A lot of moving parts, amazing campus, amazing people. And oh, by the way, I forgot to throw in along the way, I found time to get an MBA and a PhD. Yeah, I took kind of a leave of my senses somewhere in those sort of 20-year span. And then as I was nearing sort of the completion of my PhD studies, a great opportunity was presented out in Las Vegas as a CEO for the Culinary Academy of Las Vegas. Not a culinary academy in the traditional sense. It was an employee benefits organization that was created out of the collective bargaining agreement process between Culinary Union 225, Bartenders Union 165, and the largest casino and resort operators in Las Vegas. And so that organization was created to provide upskilling and reskilling for members covered under the collective bargaining agreement process, and we did that for free. And thank you to COVID. I found myself in a place where I wanted to come back home, and I had some opportunities to do so. And I'm at Oishei as a result of making that change to go from Las Vegas back to Western New York. And so the work that I do with Oishei is kind of twofold. One, I run what we like to refer to as our consulting practice for nonprofits. We help them navigate through issues that range from challenges in the relationship between a board chair and an executive director, all the way to, oh, by the way, my finance and administration enterprise is a mess. And our financial house is on fire. Can you help us navigate through that? So I deal with the consulting practice on one side, and then on the other piece, is leadership development work, primarily with the BIPOC community here in Western New York. So I've been here since 2022. It's amazing work, an amazing organization. Oishei Foundation is the largest perpetual funding nonprofit in Western New York. Ralph Wilson's a little bit larger, but they're in spend down, which is the way their foundation was created. But we are the largest perpetual foundation in the greater Western New York area. So that's me.
Awesome. Yeah, what an amazing journey. And I feel like that just gives you such a great perspective to support the nonprofit community here in Western New York. And we have had I've had the pleasure of working with you at Oishei and putting on this finance workshop for for nonprofits in Western New York over the last 4 months. And one thing that really stuck out to me is your the way that you have really just been a champion for providing infrastructure support to nonprofits. We were talking last week, and our first call when we first met each other, we're like, oh, we're going to be friends. This is, we're going to be friends. We're going to work together because we both know how important it is for nonprofit organizations to have that really strong, financial infrastructure, operational infrastructure. And so I find that really interesting because I don't have a lot of conversations with foundations that are putting as much effort and investment into that as you are at Oishei. And like I said, you're such a champion for that. So how did that come about? Has that always been something that Oishei has done, or is that something that you've brought to the role? Because I just think it's really unique.
Yeah, well, this philanthropic support work didn't begin with me. My predecessor, Karen Lee Spalding, who really is just an outstanding and just an amazing part of the nonprofit community here in the greater Western New York area. So she was the inaugural vice president for philanthropic support here. And this role came about as a result of the wisdom of one of our former and now retired executive vice presidents, Paul Hogan. He said, listen, we can write all checks all day. And I'm sure organizations would continue to accept them with open arms, but they need so much more than that. So much more, especially if they're going to go out and have the sort of impact in the community that they aspire to have, especially with fresh resources that Oishei would offer to some organizations. And so he said, we need more. We need organizations need support with identifying consultants, with infrastructure, other infrastructure supports, as you point out. And it's not that they aren't smart people or resourceful people, but they're busy out there fighting fires. And so this position was created. And so I just really built on that. And where that comes from, to answer your question specifically, comes from almost 15 years of being a CEO. Right. So first at SUNY Geneseo and then at the Culinary Academy of Las Vegas, and understanding that I couldn't go out and do the great programming work that my community of service expected if I didn't have a sound IT infrastructure, if I didn't have a sound marketing communications function, if I didn't have a sound finance and administration unit, if I didn't have a sound facilities department. And so I see those as all sort of our foundational pillars, right, that allow us to go out with confidence and do the kind of work that our community needs us to do. So it really comes from that place, and it's just logical for me to start there. And for all those who listen, I'm all too willing to support their efforts to build strength in those areas.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's huge. And, I'm sure Oishei is not the only foundation that is doing this, but I have found that it's really unique. And I work with a lot of different nonprofit organizations who get funding from a lot of different foundations. And I just don't see a lot of this, capacity building resources provided at no cost or low cost to their grantees and to the others in their community. So how do we, this is a big question. How do we change the sector, right? How can other foundations really take a lead on building capacity of their grantees, of their communities, the way that you're doing at Oishei?
Yeah, it is unique, and so I don't want to brush over that in terms of the reality. Now, what I will say is organizations do support capacity building, but maybe not to to this level of immersion, right? That we do. I mean, we come at it from a very multifaceted way, right? So at Oishei, very often I'll roll up my sleeves and work hand in hand with organizations. Say if you need board development support, I'll go to your board meetings and organize with your board chair, governance chair on what the training plan will be, and I'll go and I'll execute that. I may do that in partnership with someone like yourself, or I'll just turn it over to you, right? And so we really come at this in a very thoughtful, immersive way. Other organizations regionally, foundations, they'll support it, but they may say is okay if you write a proposal into us, we'll write you a check to support your strategic planning consultant, and then that's it, right? And so then there's everything else in between that exists. But your observation is correct. But what I will say, something that's unique, I think, to Western New York is that we do have this sort of collaborative effort in place here between the largest funders called the Nonprofit Support Group. We were formed in 2017, and we were created with this sort of founding principle of we can do more together than we can alone. And so that's comprised of the Ralph Wilson Foundation, Oishei, the Western New York Foundation, the Health Foundation of Western New York and Central New York, the Tower Foundation, ESL out of Rochester. And so we were on our way in 2017, and we had a bump in the road in 2021, 2020, 2021. And so now we're kind of getting back around the table to determine what our collective work agenda is going to be around this collective capacity building work that we all believe in. And so I'm hopeful in the years to come that we'll be able to reintroduce to Western New York this sort of suite of capacity building tools that look and feel like exactly what you and I have been working on this last half dozen months.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. So I like that it sort of, it started small and now you're building this more collaborative network to
Mm-hmm.
spread even further across this region. And so I think that's an interesting model. And for our listeners, if there are any funders out there, if there are foundations out there, just thinking about how to expand your impact, I think this is a really great example. So you see a lot of different nonprofit organizations in your work, and
Mm-hmm.
you've got a pretty broad view of the sector. Like, what trends are you seeing? What new needs or demands are out there that you're seeing nonprofits faced with right now?
There's a few things. Where do I start? Well, let me just talk about COVID, right, a little bit. Uh, so many organizations were needed to help fight COVID, right? And the world really leaned heavily on the nonprofit sector, right? I mean, for-profit needed to chip in, and not, but really the nonprofit sector needed to put the world on its shoulders and do everything from providing food assistance, transportation services, educational support, so that we can continue to delivering the learning experience through various new modalities or modalities that we really hadn't had to really lean on as much as we did during COVID. And so the nonprofit sector stepped up, right, as one might expect. But what we are finding is that because nonprofits stepped up and they had become so heavily dependent on government resources, right, during the COVID pandemic period, that they have kind of lost their way, right? And now that those resources are drying up, those organizations haven't planned for, and they don't have any design financially on how to support their organizations. And so it's creating a significant impact on the solvency of organizations, and you're finding organizations are starting to wilt. And so that's the first piece, is that organizations haven't really thought about, sort of their through cycle planning, right, or through cycle work that was required once the pandemic subsided. So that's the first thing. The second thing is people can't find good help, right? And so I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, and I'm sure your listeners will appreciate that, because that's something that's playing out in all business types, in all sectors, for profit and nonprofit. And so folks can't find good help. The last thing that I will say here, and there's a whole, and I can go on for days on this, is that nonprofits really need unrestricted support. So very often funders, they like to support programs, because everyone likes the good story. They want to attach themselves to the great initiative at, whatever food insecurity fighting organization, or whatever shelter, maybe out there. And so supporting the programs really, I think, gives folks the warm and fuzzies. But we have to learn to trust organizations and provide them with the kind of unrestricted income that they need to reinvest in staff, reinvest in infrastructure, sometimes pilot new programs. But unrestricted income, I think, is needed at a certainly what I think is an unprecedented level.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, I could not agree with each of those three things more. And I think the first one, where you're talking about funding drying up after COVID, I've definitely seen that from a financial perspective. And there has been a lack of longer term planning and forecasting. So some of this one-time money was just like not managed super well, because we didn't have a long-term forecast or long-term plan for it. And now it's gone, and it's gone. And so now I've seen organizations trying to sort of be more reactive and filling that gap versus being proactive and having had a plan and a forecast like 3 years ago, 2 years ago. So definitely seeing that. I want to talk about the second thing you said, though, about nonprofit organizations not being able to find good help. And this is a conversation that we have had, I've experienced personally. And I think part of it is the fact that nonprofits do not pay their people enough. So I'd love to hear you talk more about, people doing nonprofit work and not being paid a living wage. So you had said like helping to fight poverty, but being in poverty themselves because they're not making a living wage. So talk more about that issue in the sector.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, I think by and large, people who enlist in the army that's needed to fight, so many social challenges. The people who normally enlist are people who historically have been closest to those sort of challenges, right? And so they see it, and they feel a certain calling and just sort of passion and drive to do that work. And you just kind of run into the burning house, and you say, well, it'll come in time. The money will be there, right? But once you get into the work, it just kind of pulls you in further and further and further. Yet the dollars don't come in to support the organization, and by default, they don't come in to support your staff. And this is especially true if you're an executive director or CEO of a nonprofit. You'll very quickly say, "Pay my people first. Whatever resources are there, you pay my people first." And so I think this is really, we're at a place where funders, and when I say funders, I want to include the federal government, state government, county governments, local municipalities. I think it's time for us to have a conversation around, what sort of restrictions do we need to lift around administrative dollars that we want to allocate for a particular grant, right? Those levels are incredibly low, right? What sort of conversations do we want to have around the realities of what we need to properly fund a grant? So in other words, if I'm asking for if I'm asking for a certain report out, shouldn't we be funding, right, the report out or the reporting requirements for a grant, right? If I'm asking you for some data, again, whether that's a grant that's supported by public money or private dollars through a foundation, if I'm asking you to provide data, right, should I not be willing to also fund the sort of the data enterprise or data supports that you need, whether they be people, software, whatever, right? But again, all too often those things aren't supported, and so an organization's resources continue to be stretched, right? And so if I do have the luxury of an internal support around IT or data analyses, and then those people wind up being stretched and ultimately find themselves in a place of burnout, right? And so, whereas once upon a time, maybe I had an 8 to 10 hour day, now my day is a 12-hour day or a 14 or 15-hour day. And an organization has no way of paying people. And so it's total compensation, right? So it's not just wage, it's employee benefits. From a healthcare perspective, there's other sort of wellness benefits that certainly should be included in there. We've been talking recently about sabbaticals to help try to mitigate some of the effects of what folks are experiencing from a work wellness and burnout perspective. So it's total compensation, but it should not be lost on your listeners that this is something that will never be appropriately addressed if we don't also bring in public entities into the both the discovery and solution building process, because that's where the wealth of resources are for the nonprofit community.
Yeah, I mean, I could not agree with you more. And also, I think one thing that you said last week during our session, we were having a really interesting conversation with about 20 nonprofit leaders here in Buffalo. We were live and in person, and we're having a conversation about overhead and, this sort of this like belief in the nonprofit sector that overhead is bad and we're trying to keep overhead low. And I thought one thing that you said that was so interesting was, listen, we need you all as nonprofit leaders to tell us, like, how much does it actually cost to run this program? And like, don't put 5% of someone's salary into the grant if it's really going to take 50% of their time. Like, tell us how much it actually costs. And I thought that was like kind of profound, actually, because as on the side of like preparing the budget for the proposal, we're always trying to like make overhead as low as possible. But then what ends up happening is that we're crunched and we don't have the money available to actually do the sort of unrestricted stuff that we need to do. So I just thought that was so powerful. Like, tell us how much it actually costs. Like, some of this is also on us as nonprofit leaders. Like, we shouldn't be trying to, cram things into a 5% overhead budget. So how does that play out in real life? Like, when you get a proposal and you do see like a bigger salary amount, are you measuring, your proposals against a certain, like, oh, it has to be within this percent overhead? Are you looking at it more holistically? Like, okay, this is what it's going to take to get the job done. And, or you know what I mean? I don't know. Talk more about that.
Yeah. Yeah, so we look at it, our program officers look at it through a more holistic lens, right? And so but recently we have been having those conversations around what sorts of new questions do we need to be asking. And so in my work, right, that is exactly what I do, is that I partner with our program officers whenever there is, say, a proposal that they want to have a much clearer understanding around whether what's written on paper can actually be supported by the dollars that that an organization is asking us for. And often I'll go in and it won't, right? And so not and so it's not that I want us to write a bigger check. I want us to write the right check, right, for a foundation. And so often over the last couple of years, I have had to go into organizations and say, I don't know that you're going to be able to find a controller for $60,000 in this environment, right, for a budget of $10 million, right? And oh, by the way, your time to fill is probably going to be maybe 6, 8 months, right? Given the very competitive nature of the job market. And so what do you do in the meantime? Maybe you need some temporary sort of support. Maybe you go to Robert Half. So you should include that also in your budget. And so at the Oishei Foundation, we've been working as intentionally as we possibly can around making sure that folks are successful, right? And so because if they're not, we're going to see them again in another six months to a year. All right, so let's measure twice and cut once, as I like to say often. But the other piece is the reality around all of this, Stephanie, is that many operators, nonprofit operators, are they are approaching this from a scarcity mindset, right? And so that's the way they run their businesses. And oh, by the way, nonprofits are businesses, and at some point we should talk about that. All right. But what they're saying is that if I ask for too much now, I may not be able to ask for more later, right? Or if I can't ask for more later, it may be a few years down the line. And so what you have inherent to that thinking is this sort of undercutting, right, of your of your work. I had a nonprofit in Niagara Falls, New York, tell me, and that's, what can we, what do funders need to know? And he said to me, and in verbatim, he said they need to stop playing with the ask. So if I ask for $1 million, don't come back and give me $500,000. He said because what's going to happen is I'm going to take the $500,000, right, and I'm going to figure out how to do the $1 million program, right, and that's what nonprofits do, and it's just this we perpetuate this vicious cycle, right, of sort of undercutting, the work, right, that nonprofits really need to do. So don't play with the ask. That would be a message to funders.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I haven't heard that before, but when you said that example, I'm like, oh yeah, I've seen every single nonprofit I know who asked for $1 million, get 500,000 and figure out, okay, we're still going to do the $1 million, but now we just have to do it on way less resources and basically burn out our entire staff. So,
That's right.
oh my gosh. Definitely have seen that before. One thing I have seen that's really interesting, and I don't know if you've seen this elsewhere in the sector, I haven't seen it a lot, but I have seen some funders compensating nonprofits for the proposal and the due diligence process before they're even funded. And so, like, I saw this one funder pay, I don't know, $10,000 or $20,000 to a nonprofit for their time in putting together the proposal and going through the due diligence. I think in this case, the organization did end up getting the grant as well. But even if they didn't get the grant, at least they got some compensation for the like dozens of hours that it took to put together that proposal. And I've seen like so many onerous requirements from funders in terms of proposal, due diligence, and then on the other side, reporting. And have you seen that? Have you seen that before, either at Oishei or elsewhere, where there's compensation for the actual proposal process?
I haven't seen it as much at Oishei, but I'm going to steal that one. Thank you. And so we'll talk about if there's a way to do that here at Oishei. But one thing we have been working to do is to make the process less onerous, right? And so let's make it easier for you to submit a request. One, and two, we've enlisted new ways to go about the report out process, right? So in other words, you don't have to write a dissertation, right? We've been taking sort of video reports. And so so from a 360 perspective, so from the time you submit to the time you report out, we've just been trying to make the process much less onerous. But I do like the idea, because I don't care how many burdens you relieve a person of, there's still going to be some time that's required to put together a proposal. But I do like that idea of compensating people for that time.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I'm sure all of your grantees appreciate the efforts that you've taken. I've seen so many like questionnaires and report templates from different funders. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure they just asked the question like 6 different ways. And this feels like a test that they're trying to trick us. Like it doesn't have to be like this. So
And
I'm sure your grantees appreciate it.
and you know what I was just kind of thinking, right, out loud here, this kind of following this stream here. I also like potentially staffing the idea of compensating people who receive a declination letter as well, right? So
Mm,
organizations that aren't successful. So, we certainly receive far more requests than we actually fund. So I like
mhm.
the idea of coming up with something whereby we are also remunerating people for their time, even if they aren't successful. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, so you said before nonprofits are businesses, and we had a bit of a conversation about that last week during our session as well. And could not agree with you more. Um, and one thing that I think about as, nonprofits are businesses are using data and technology to enhance your mission and your analysis. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about that and what you've seen nonprofits doing in terms of using data, using technology, and really operating as a business.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I would say that the tide is starting to turn, right? Just based on, all of the external sort of influences and pressures on nonprofits, right? Particularly in Western New York, right? Because our funding community, let's just be honest, isn't as robust as, say, a New York City or a Boston or Chicago. There's just not as many resources. And so organizations, I think, are now starting to work smarter, and they're starting to think about how data might help them to make more informed decisions, particularly organizations I find that are working in healthcare spaces, organizations that are working in workforce development spaces. And so we're seeing more that be data, right, in terms of how we make decisions being used and used in those spaces. What I will say, and I'm hopeful we'll start to see some uptick, particularly as it relates to combating labor shortages. And some folks may not agree, but I do think artificial intelligence can help, particularly during those periods where either you don't have funding for a position, or it's taken a while to fill a position. I do think there are areas where AI could be helpful. So I've not seen any real good examples where folks are starting to use AI, but I do think it's harmful as it can be, for sure, right? And so we want to put the reins on, right, in terms of how we use data and how we use some of these advanced technologies, AI, AR, VR, XR, gamified apps. I think we should explore those things in whole, but we have to be careful about the sort of impact on humankind and how dangerous they can be. But why I'm starting to see data be used more and more, particularly in the workforce development space and in the healthcare space.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I've had a couple conversations with people who are using AI tools like ChatGPT to help write grant proposals and,
Yep.
help sort of build that out. And I don't it'll never be in my opinion, it will never be a substitute for that more like personal language. You can kind of tell when something is generated by that, but I do think it's a tool that, could help nonprofits get a little bit further ahead without necessarily hiring another position. So yeah, I definitely think that's interesting.
And and
I have just
and,
oh,
and it's a
go ahead.
final note on that, right? I mean, we're just talking about a scarcity of resources. I do think if we employ technology, particularly AI, it may leave more resources available to pay people a fair wage, give increases where you can, et cetera. So just a sort of repositioning of the resources or the chess pieces on the board if organizations can find a way to properly use tools like AI.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I like that idea.
Mhm.
I have just two more questions for you.
Okay.
The first is, what tips do you have for nonprofits to build relationships with their funders? And so I've been able to witness the relationship that you have as a, foundation employee with some of your funders, some of your grantees. And it just feels like they can come to you with challenges and with questions. And I think that's so powerful. And so what tips do you have for nonprofit leaders to help sort of build that kind of relationship with their funders?
Mm, I think um, the starting point is and I think it goes without sort of saying, right? And is that both sides have to be, have to prioritize building trust, right? So that we can have thoughtful conversations, right, over the course of whatever our relationship is going to be, and honest conversations, right, around around this relationship that we're going to build. And I think we have to honor everyone's time, right? And so the relationship, I think is best built over many um conversations that happen over multiple modalities. Maybe it's a quick cup of coffee, maybe it's a quick phone call, maybe it's a short text, maybe it's an email. And so I think over time now we've built sort of like micro credentials, right? We have all of these small little sort of relationship building pieces, right? That now over time come together to form this really honest relationship, right? That's built on sort of acknowledging the realities of what I'm up against. And then finally, you can ask for something without asking for it, right? And so I think over time, if you center the organization and the issues that you're dealing with, over time, the funder will see that your organization is best suited to fight the battles around food insecurity or transport, whatever it is, and you're the best leader of the organization that's best suited to fight those challenges. Again, if you build that relationship over a period of time, and you don't always have to ask, the funder will see it. And so I would think, those are a handful of tips that I would offer. Is that build the relationship around trust. Everyone center that first, right? And work to build the relationship over multiple types of interactions with the funder. Hey, can we get together for coffee? Just want to keep you updated. I don't need anything. I just want to give you an update on what's going on. Quick 30-minute coffee chat, or can we get on the Zoom? Um, but smaller interactions amassed over a longer period of time, I think it's kind of like the analogy I use is that would you rather sell one record for 10 million copies, or would you rather sell 10 records at 1 million copies each, right? And so I would hope that folks would choose the latter. And so to me, I see relationship building in the same way, right? Let's not go for the home run when we get up to bat. Let's just see if we can get on base, right? Let's get a bunch of ones and twos, and eventually we'll win the game.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that analogy. And I think of like all the little deposits into the bank of the relationship. And I love the idea of just, offering to provide an update, go have coffee without needing anything. I like how you said that. I don't need anything. I just want to share with you like how we're doing, what's going on. And I think as a result of that, like I saw last week during our session where you were able to just get up in front of this group of 20 different nonprofit leaders and say, hey, let's have a conversation. What do you all need after this? What kind of infrastructure support, what kind of consulting support do you need? And everybody was so open and so willing to share. And you could tell, and you were so receptive to everyone's feedback. And so you could tell that that sort of conversation was the result of all of those like little deposits in that relationship bank that y'all had had for a long time. So so I think that's really powerful. And thinking of that relationship as less transactional and more of a relationship, I think is a great tip. So my last question for you that I asked to all of our guests is, what does a prosperous nonprofit look like to you?
Prosperous nonprofit. Uh, mm. Well, I don't know if there's really such a thing as a prosperous nonprofit, but I think a successful nonprofit, I think an effective, well-run nonprofit, right? What that looks like to me is one that has a strong foundation, right? And one and two, and we talked about what that foundation is, right? So I won't go back to that. And two, one that has a very clear understanding of its business model. You got to be clear on that. You have to be, Stephanie. I can't, if I could say that 10 times in a row, so that folks have a crystallized understanding. You have to have a strong understanding of what your business model is. Do not kid yourself, right? And so if you're selling tomatoes, sell tomatoes. All right, and you can work on all other sorts of derivatives around selling tomatoes and tomato culture and all that, but don't start selling mushrooms, right? If that's not your deal, or if you don't have a well thought out plan, one that's going to be supported financially to the level that you can ensure success, but just have a clear understanding of your business model and how it's funded, right? So that's the second thing I would say. The third thing that I would say is um, a well-run, prosperous, successful nonprofit knows how and when to make tough decisions. They don't wait too long. All too often, Stephanie, we find organizations will hold on to a program long after its funding support, right, has been discontinued. So whether it's a program that was funded by us, by the state, or by a funder, right, and the dollars have dried up, but because the organization sees a need, they keep on keeping on, but they don't have the dollars to support them, and it winds up stretching and consuming the organization's resources. And so that would be the third thing I would say, is an organization that knows when to make tough decisions. And then finally, I think an effective, successful, prosperous organization is one that's trademarked by a really well orchestrated governance structure. You have a good, strong board that works in partnership with management to build a sound organizational operating plan, strategic plan, sustainability plans, whatever plan. But you have a well-run, highly functioning board that believes in noses in, fingers out, right? And in building partnership with management to build the most successful organization possible. So those would be the four things that really stand out, to me, and those are things that we prioritize here at Oishei when we're doing capacity building work.
That's such a good answer. I love your mention of governance and board because I ask everybody this question and I don't know if I've ever gotten that answer before. I mean, there's no right answer, right? Like what makes a prosperous nonprofit is different to everybody, but I think you're so right about governance and board because if you have a like dysfunctional board, the organization is going to be a mess. So
Mhm,
I think that's yeah,
mhm,
that's huge. That's huge.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
Mark, this has been so helpful. I have an entire page of notes that I'm excited to like put on our website and attach to this episode because it's been so useful. And I know that our listeners are going to really take a lot away from this. So I want to thank you again for joining me here. I just appreciate your wisdom and your partnership so much. So thank you so much.
So happy to be here today. It was my pleasure to do it. Know that I'd love to come back anytime. I'll bring my nonprofit friends with me. So look forward to our continuing relationship.
Awesome. Thank you.
Got it.